I am a thinker and an activist. As a thinker, one of my concerns has been to develop ideas that can help inform the imagination of better ways to organize contemporary societies. As an activist, I have been engaged for my whole life in the politics of my country, Brazil. There I have fought for a direction of development that gives economic and educational opportunity to the mass of ordinary Brazilians. It is as both a thinker and an activist that I here address the problems and prospects of China. The whole world has a stake in the future of that great country. The Chinese people today face 5 fateful choices. The first is about the direction of national development. The second, about the organization of the national economy in the future. The third, about the character of education. The fourth, about the reformation of political life. And the fifth, about ideas and the task of the intelligentsia. The answers given to these 5 sets of questions are all connected. I argue that with respect to each of these 5 fateful choices, there is a minimalist position and a maximalist position. The minimalist position is the one that is more modest and appears to be more realistic. It is the path of least resistance, because it is the position that least disturbs the established interests and the prevailing ideas. But it is not enough. It is not enough, I want to argue, to guarantee the twofold objective of individual empowerment and national greatness. The minimalist response cannot therefore be faithful to the shared element in the 2 Chinese revolutions of the 20th century, both of which sought liberation for the Chinese people and affirmation of the national cause. The first fateful choice has to do with the redirection of national development. It is widely recognized, both within and outside China, that in the future, China must rely relatively more on the internal market and relatively less on production for export. And it is also generally understood that this reorientation to the internal market, this deepening of the internal market, will require redistribution among classes, among regions, and among sectors. The question is how much and in what form. The minimalist response would say only as much redistribution as is absolutely necessary to make possible the reorientation of production to the internal market. The maximalist response says, on the contrary, we can use this imperative of redirection of the development strategy as the point of departure for major and massive redistribution among classes, among regions, and among sectors. Not only as much redistribution as we need to tolerate in order to make the reorientation of development possible, but as much redistribution as we can achieve. Redistribution because it is necessary to the twofold cause of individual empowerment and national greatness. The second fateful choice has as its subject the organization of the national economy in the future. A new style of production is beginning to emerge all over the world. It is characterized not simply by the accumulation of technology, capital, and knowledge, but also and above all by a set of advanced practices of production, attenuating the contrast between roles of supervision and of execution, relativizing all specialized work roles, mixing cooperation and competition in the same activities, and transforming production into a practice of permanent innovation and of collective learning, so that the best firms become more like the best schools. The problem is that the vast majority of the labor force, in the richer countries as well as in the developing ones, remains excluded from these productive vanguards. Will China establish the new economy in the form that now prevails in the world, that is to say, a socially exclusive form? Or will it struggle to establish the new economy in a socially inclusive form, disseminating the advanced practices of production throughout large sectors of the economy and of the society, and opening the gateways of access to these productive vanguards? This maximalist response would require a whole series of innovations in the way of organizing a market economy. On the one hand, between the government, both the national government and local governments, and the productive businesses, a form of strategic coordination that is decentralized, pluralistic, participatory, and experimental. And among the firms, especially the small and medium-sized firms, a regime of cooperative competition so that they can pool resources and achieve economies of scale through this pooling, even as they continue to compete against one another. Such a reshaping of the market economy for the sake of establishing the new economy in inclusive form could take as a point of departure the multitude of institutional innovations that already exist in China, innovations like the township village enterprises. Many of these innovations were motivated by the purpose of reconciling the governmentally controlled enterprises and their regime with the new forms of private activity. But now they can be enlisted in the greater purpose of establishing the new economy in inclusive form. The third fateful choice that the Chinese people face regards the nature of education. Will China in the future be a nation of copiers or a nation of innovators? The minimalist response would say education, yes, but education in a traditional form, oriented to information, to memory, to the encyclopedia. And then the result is that China becomes or remains, to a very large extent, a nation of copiers, and the power of innovation is confined to an intellectual or scientific elite. The maximalist response insists on a radical change in the character of education for the majority, for the masses. What it wants is a form of education that is analytic and problem-solving in its method, that uses information selectively and deeply as a device for the acquisition of analytic capabilities, that prefers cooperation in teaching and in learning to the combination of individualism and authoritarianism characterizing the traditional classroom, and that is dialectical in its approach to all received knowledge. Every subject would be taught from contrasting points of view. The implication for the relation between general education and technical training is that they could no longer be represented or organized as opposites. They would be on a spectrum, on a continuum. General education oriented to analysis, technical training according priority to generic and flexible practical and conceptual capabilities, rather than to the job-specific and machine-specific skills that were paramount in the old forms of industrial production. The fourth fateful choice faced by the Chinese people has to do with the reformation of political life. The minimalist position would say it's enough to put limits on corruption, to ensure meritocracy in the selection and promotion of cadres, and to guarantee greater transparency and accountability, especially at the local level. But there are two objections to this minimalist response to the task of reorganizing the political life of the country. The first objection is that it cannot achieve its own professed objective unless there is popular vigilance based on popular organization. There will be no way to prevent the conversion of political power into private advantage and of private wealth into political influence. The second objection is that it fails to provide what the Chinese people need in order to create an alternative future. A discourse in which they can explore their future. There is no blueprint in which China can discover its future by reading a book. The future must be a collective discovery and a collective construction, and that is the meaning of democracy. The maximalist response, therefore, has three elements. The first element is ensure a contest of visions, with or without a pluralism of political forces or political parties. The second element is reconcile strong coordination and decision at the center with the ability in particular localities or sectors to create counter models of the national future. The third element is permit and indeed encourage the independent and universal organization of civil society outside the state. Only an organized civil society full of neighborhood associations, of professional organizations, of associations of workers, can generate alternative images of its national future and act on them. A strong and organized civil society is not the antithesis of a strong state. On the contrary, it is the condition for the development of a strong state. The fifth fateful choice has to do with the ideas that can guide these alternatives, and therefore with the task of the intelligentsia. As the Chinese intellectuals lost faith in Marxism, their tendency was simply to convert to the dominant schools of thought in the West. The trouble is that these dominant schools of thought in all the established social sciences and in the prevailing policy discourse are entirely deficient in structural imagination, in the understanding of the power of the basic institutional arrangements and ideological assumptions to shape the life of society, in the ability to grasp the importance of structural discontinuity in history, and therefore, as well, in the power to imagine structural alternatives. What then, on the maximalist vision, should the Chinese intelligentsia do? It should not simply reproduce the intellectual tendencies that now predominate in the Western academy. On the one hand, it should rescue the salvageable element in the Marxist tradition, the rational kernel in the mystical shell, which is insight into the importance of structure, and therefore as well ability to imagine alternative structures. And on the other hand, it should contest the methods and the orthodoxies that now prevail across the whole field of social and historical studies. It should contest these methods and these orthodoxies with the aim of reestablishing the link that is now severed between insight into the actual and imagination of the possible. This task is much more than intellectual, it is also spiritual. And it is inspired by fidelity to the twofold aim of individual empowerment and of national greatness. The response given to these 5 fateful choices will shape the future of the nation.